Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I know it's been a long but very exciting and interesting day of papers. We have one final session that will be formatted as the others, but I'm very happy now to turn it over for our final session on collecting's past and future. With Lynn Dorwaldt, who has been Special Collections Librarian at the Wagner Free Institute of Science, another natural history collection here in Philadelphia, since 2002, where she manages all aspects of the Institute's special collections. At the Wagner, she enjoys working with the diverse array of collection types and is especially interested in exploring ways to present the connections between these collections. She is also working on ways to combine historical and current scientific information in the description of specimens. And I think she's really an ideal person to help connect a lot of the threads that we've heard about today, and also to think through the ways that collections have formed in the past, in the present, and also going into the future. So I will turn it over to you, Lynn, to introduce our speakers.
Oh, I can just see over the top of the podium. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Adriana, for having me as part of this amazing conference. And thanks to the APS and the Academy for putting this all together, and everyone that has given these amazing presentations. We have 4 what I think you guys are going to think are really interesting papers coming up on collecting pasts and futures. First up will be Matthew Dennis, who is Professor of History and Environmental Studies Emeritus at the University of Oregon, where he taught courses on early America, public memory and commemoration, American environmental and cultural history, and urbanism and American cities. His books include Cultivating a Landscape of Peace, Iroquois European Encounters in the 17th Century America, Seneca Possessed, Indians, Witchcraft, and Power in the Early American Republic, and American Relics and the Politics of Public Memory. He is currently at work on a book, Bloodwork, The Bloody Shirt in American History and Public Memory. Whitney Barlow Robles holds a PhD from Harvard and is a rally-based writer and a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College. Her first book, Curious Species, How Animals Made Natural History, came out with Yale University Press in November 2023. She also curated the prize-winning digital exhibition titled The Kitchen and the Cabinet, Histories of Food and Science, which tells the stories of centuries-old food artifacts that have survived to the present despite their perishable nature by being preserved in scientific collections. She is now embarking on a second book project about the history of museums and collecting. Sean Liu is a master's student at Georgetown University, pursuing a double degree in global history and foreign service. His research delves into Chinese environmental history with a focus on the zoopolitical dynamics of the Beijing Zoo post-1949. Sean explores how state-sanctioned narratives and sociopolitical context shape human relationships with nature. Elaina Foley is a German Chancellor Fellow through the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, pursuing questions of relation, ethics, and decay within natural history museums. Supported by the Yale Smithsonian Research Fund, their work considers natural history collections and infrastructures through site-specific residencies at the Berlin Museum for Naturkunde, Smithsonian, and Yale Peabody Museum. Elaina is a graduate of Yale College, where their senior thesis, Sensible Hauntings, Ethics and Narratives in Ornithological Specimen Preservation at Yale's Peabody Museum, was awarded multiple prizes for its use of archival and collections-based research. So I'll now pass it over to Matthew Dennis.
I will never win an Oscar, but I can't resist thanking the Academy. And of course, the APS. It's just such an honor to be here in the wake of all these sessions, and just knowing everything, the history of the American Philosophical Society. I first did research here in 1982 for my dissertation and my first book, so it's great to be back in the presence of this, brilliant and provocative group. the kind of labor of natural history that I'm talking about today is really a political, cultural sort of labor. So it's a little bit different, but I hope you'll find it at least provocative. Oh, and let me thank Thomas also for magically getting this up. I mean, the AV stuff is just can be such a challenge, and it's just been seamless. And for all the unnamed technical whizzes, I really appreciate that. Yeah. This paper is about relics of natural history, which might strike us initially as a misnomer or oxymoronic. It begins with the origins of the Massachusetts Historical Society, which was founded in 1791. In 1809, the MHS compiled a catalog of its cabinet, chronicling in it all the articles which have from time to time been presented to the Society. It was organized alphabetically, beginning with A, animals, with item number 1 listed as frog, horned, in spirit, probably rum or wherever the necessary liquid was, and continuing with alligator, a young one, number 2. The next page itemized animals, parts of them, and referenced bats, birds, and so on. And as it proceeded, the catalog documented an astonishing array of natural historical objects interspersed with historical ones. I don't have a partridge in a pear tree, and I don't have a footnote here to Dr. Seuss, but it seems like a kind of Seussical list. Among the historical, natural historical items was a pair of rhinoceros horns, the gift of one Reverend William Bentley in 1798 and 1801, the tooth of a sea cow, 3 bills of the albatross, the skin of a young penguin, an iguana, a special species of lizard, a white otter, very rare, a centipede in spirits from Bengal, 2 ostrich eggs, a petrified fish, various fossils and minerals, and here was a circular letter asking for this sorts of stuff from the MHS, and this is the kind of stuff that they were trying to accumulate. Various fossils and minerals, an assortment of native artifacts from the North and South America, Peruvian bark, a snake skin from Calcutta, seashells, including one from Sumatra, weighing 100 pounds, and wood specimens from Demerara, a Dutch colony, later a British colony, today part of Guyana, contributed by Gilbert H. Hubbard in 1796. The catalog ended with W. The cabinet apparently had not yet acquired any items beginning in X, Y, or Z, not even a zebra skin, which the Peel Museum had. Its botanical holdings of nearly 2,000 specimens were off-site. According to the curatorial note, they had been borrowed with permission of the cabinet keeper in 1795 by the Harvard botanist, entomologist, and zoologist W.D. Peck, in whose possession they remained indefinitely. I don't know if he ever gave them back. So what to make of this seemingly haphazard conglomeration of stuff? The collection certainly had all the characteristics of old-fashioned cabinets of curiosity, filled with wonders to delight viewers, not as systematic assemblages of scientific data, but rather as strange random gatherings of exotic things. The MHS cabinet was a vestige of such Wunderkammer practices, but like the American Museum of Charles Wilson Peel, it also presaged the growth of the modern Natural History Museum. And so we have, history, we have these kind of odd examples of museums that were, kind of curiosity-based, not really yet natural historical museums, until we get to Peel. By the early 19th century, Peel had adopted an Linnaean taxonomy to organize his collection, and we can detect a similar interest in scientific order and management in Professor Peck's consultations for the MHS. Peck had borrowed the collection in order to examine it more fully, rectify the sheets that secured plant specimens, and compiled a more complete botanical catalog with better descriptions and classification nomenclature in Latin. I will call some of these things relics. And so you've seen this slide before. We can see the order. and the system. And we can see in Peck's writing, again, this sort of modern-looking kind of interest in the natural sciences, and we can see this kind of invitation to contribute to the Massachusetts Historical Society or to any number of other scientific organizations. So I'm going to call some of the things that are in these collections relics. But in a technical sense, such objects exhibited in Philadelphia or Boston were not exactly relics. They seem more like specimens, and we've talked about this. Relics are extraordinary objects revered for their unique association with or their actual embodiment of the past. Specimens, on the other hand, are necessarily ordinary, common things which, through their very commonness, exemplify larger patterns or systems. They are exemplary rather than unusual, with one sample being more or less interchangeable with another. As such, they help illustrate the systematic workings of the natural world, emphasizing regular natural and physical processes over unique events, with even the latter, at a volcanic eruption, say, ultimately reduced through science into discoverable patterns. Weird horned animals, mammoth bird eggs, or colossal oyster shells, on the other hand, appeared freakish to North American viewers. But like animals or plants more familiar to Americans, they were, in the end, merely constituent parts of an orderly global natural world. And thus, rhinoceros horns and penguin skins were both ordinary and extraordinary within the collections of museums in the early American Republic. They were not relics in the sense of the relict, with a T on the end, that is, something notable left behind, residual, personifying the past. And yet, might they have been relics nonetheless, based on their extraordinary power as rare objects to signify individually and collectively that the United States was assuming a legitimate and distinguished place within the community of nations and the transatlantic world of science? Reduced to niches in a universal taxonomy, such things still showed that North America existed within this universe, which American naturalists helped to define and expand with its museums functioning as centers, not merely peripheries. Moreover, removed from their original context and presented within American collections, the objects of natural history could embody a deeper biological and geological past, as well as a promising American present and future. These things spoke, offering a new narrative, not only about the natural world, but also about the social and political universe that orchestrated their display. Natural history and national history merged. American natural historical specimens evidencing a continent of extraordinary national endowments and potential could also function as relics, material associations encouraging Americans to create a sense of national antiquity and connection with their landscapes, each other, and destiny. Quote, the United States is blessed by divine providence with admirable treasures in all their domains, the domains of nature. Discovery and improving knowledge of them will continuing open new sources of ease, wealth, and happiness. Such comments, like this one inspired by a visit to the Peale's Museum in 1790, emphasized the utilitarian. Similarly, a circular letter that I showed you earlier, sent by the MHS to publicize its natural history ambitions, quote, the forming of an extensive cabinet comprising the various natural productions of our country, the adjacent isles and neighboring seas. It focused on the practical and the economic value of the country's natural resources, geological as well as biological, and encouraging American expansion. Quote, it is not only pleasing and advantageous to students in chemistry and mineralogy, but may prove of immense public benefit to have specimens of clay, marl, lime, coals, metals, and other mineral substances deposited in public collections. Here, artists and manufacturers may examine and compare the specimens found among us with those of the Old World, and thus be often led to explore these regions in which probably treasures abound of curious and valuable materials in the various arts. But natural history exhibits presented pride as well as material promise as they indexed nature's nation. They helped Americans comprehend the range, diversity, maturity, and economic potential, as well as the wonder and aesthetic greatness of their country's natural features, and through material contact with them, forge a national identity. They were a treasure, such that the MHS regulations dictated that the American curiosities shall be kept by themselves in the best part of the cabinet. Landscape painting, later in the century, would more easily evoke the aesthetic appeal, experience, and power of American nature, and purvey it to audiences remotely. But objects could also do the trick, more directly, materially, and relic-like, emphasizing Americans' encounter with that landscape, sometimes representing mastery or conquest beyond the abstract imperium of natural science. In November 1804, for example, the MHS accepted, quote, a piece of rock broken from the summit of the White Hills in New Hampshire, called by Dr. Belknap, the president, the founder of the MHS, Mount Washington. One Samuel A. Hadley had climbed the famed peak that September and spent the night in its open air with some friends, as had another party in August, which had left a memento, a bottle of oil, to mark the occasion. Hadley's compatriots too memorialized their Mount Washington ascent, with hammer and chisel cutting their initials and the date into a summit stone outcropping. They also collected and took away a material token and saw it ensconced in the MHS cabinet. An ordinary rock that might have come from anywhere was thus transformed into a relic by Hadley's experience, which others could join vicariously. No mere rock, it had become a touchstone, a fragment of the natural monument transported from New Hampshire and deployed in Boston to tell a story of American natural grandeur and American mastery. We don't know exactly how viewers experienced this natural artifact, or if it actually connected them to the sublime landscape of its origin, inspiring awe or pride or national feeling. It most likely did not produce quite the same reaction as a later addition to the MHS rock collection, pieces of Plymouth rock, a historic relic embedded more deeply in American legend and myth. But Americans increasingly found the antiquities they seemed to lack in natural monuments like Mount Washington, the Natural Bridge in Virginia, or the mysterious mounds of the continent's interior. Naturalizing ancient Indian ruins and reimagining natural topographies as architectural ruins, scholars in the early Republic clad their new nation with a patina of antiquity. Thomas Jefferson could find, quote, an architectural aesthetic of Enlightenment, neoclassicism, in the marvel of the Natural Bridge. For he ascribing to this wonder, located on his land in Western Virginia, elements of the classic mean of Palladio, according to literary scholar and historian Gordon Sayre. The naturalist William Bartram similarly infused nature with cultural significance, obscuring, quote, the distinction between the worlds of nature and of the ancients. Mounds of earth with the passage of time had come to blend into the forest so well that the works of man and nature were easily confounded. From different directions, from nature to culture, and from culture to nature, Jefferson and Bartram and others saw in the American landscape a natural architecture. Here, Americans imitated the neoclassical fantasies of Europeans, who cultivated antique grandeur by collecting antiquities or constructing new artificial ruins or follies in gardens and country estates. But in America, more often their medium was not ancient Greece or Rome, but rather North American nature. Astonishing archaeological findings and the decaying architectural remains of the continent's indigenous inhabitants. America, as it turned out, was dotted with monuments. The early national poet, Philip Freneau, captured some of this natural architecture, the blending of the natural and the artificial, in his 1787 poem, The Indian Burying Ground. Describing an ancient place of native interment, one of these mounds, white Americans increasingly happened upon, he wrote, "Thou stranger that shall come this way, no fraud upon the dead commit. Observe the swelling turf and say, they do not lie, here they sit." Here still a lofty rock remains, of which the curious eye may trace, now wasted half by wearing reins the fancies of a ruder race. We might wonder about that lofty grave-marking rock and what it represents, a geological feature perhaps, altered to indicate the entombment of a revered ancestor, or perhaps selected because of its extraordinary natural qualities and transformed conceptually by an act of native sanctification, even if it was not materially altered. Physically modified by human artifice or not, the rock had become monumental, and yet time and the elements had relentlessly weathered it, naturalizing it and erasing human traces. For the Indian, it might remain as cultural distinction, might retain its cultural distinction and meaning, even in its eroded state, while it appeared raw and primordial to the stranger that shall come this way, that is, to white colonizing newcomers. The monumental stone of Fresneau's poem, like other arresting features of the North American landscape, could thus simultaneously be natural and artificial, an occurrence of American natural architecture. By the early 19th century, more than 100 years of learned scientific writing had advanced the case, at least metaphorically, for treating notable features of natural history as monuments. Monuments were cultural, not natural by definition. Etymologically, the word comes from the classical Latin monumentum, meaning a commemorative statue or building, a tomb, a reminder, based on the Latin root monere, to remind. From the beginning, since the 14th century, monuments were understood to be human creations, especially grand, imposing, or old things. By their survival, they commemorated and distinguish a person, action, period, or event. But at least by the late 17th century, some natural philosophers and historians used the term to denote periods and events in natural history. The ancient scientist Robert Hooke, for example, in his posthumous works, echoing a lecture of 1668, wrote about the emerging fossil record of the Earth. These shells and other bodies are the medals, urns, or monuments of nature. These are the greatest and most lasting monuments of antiquity, which in all probability will far antedate all the most recent monuments of the world, even the very pyramids, obelisks, mummies, hieroglyphics, and coins, and will afford more information in natural history than all those others put together will in civil. Drawing on this tradition, American naturalists sought to make sense of the massive bones discovered in Kentucky and in the environs of the Hudson River Valley near Albany, in Western Virginia, along the Wabash, by arguing in a way that merged biblical and scientific analysis that the American incognitum or mammoth was among the remains of the Great Deluge, like other monuments of that calamitous and fatal eruption. As the French naturalist Georges Cuvier wrote in the late 18th century, it is now universally known that the globe which we inhabit on every side presents irresistible proofs of the greatest revolutions. The varied productions of living nature, which embellish the surface, is but a garment covering the ruins of an antecedent state of nature. The remnants of organized bodies in which everywhere found, buried in the various strata which form the external crust of the globe. According to Cuvier, nature is pleased with exhibiting the monuments of her power. Fossils, particularly gigantic monumental remains, become the physical relics of the emerging universal history of nature that natural philosophers were striving to write for the earth. And that natural history, Cuvier allowed, encompassed every side of the globe, including the American side of the Atlantic world. So I don't have to talk about the exhumation of the mastodon because we've already heard about that. But it's very interesting, and I think Victor might have quoted from Peale's son's work, showing first this is the ferocious version, the saber-tooth mastodon, which was a riposte to Buffon, I guess. That was corrected, and ultimately, of course, they took it on the road and wrote themselves into the Atlantic world of science, and ironically, this is that nondescript or incognitum today, which I think is in Darmstadt. The story of the nondescript or incognitum is an American specimen and a relic. It begins earlier and continues beyond the scope of the paper, but for now we can conclude that such discoveries would become founding objects of American national and natural history, and their collection, circulation, and exhibition, they help to make the new world, they make the new world and the new nation old. Thank you.
I'll also start by noting, as others have, that we are on Lenape territory. All of the early American collections that I'll be talking about today were on ancestral homelands. And most of my talk is going to focus on the early modern period and the first chapter of a new book project that I'm working on. But before we get there, we first need to understand, by way of background, why the Loch Ness Monster has a scientific name. In December 1975, Nessie received the title Nessiteris rhombopteryx from Sir Peter Scott and Robert Rines in an article published in the premier scientific journal Nature. And the story behind their paper is unusual for reasons beyond its fantastical subject matter. Most animal species are quite literally defined by dead bodies resting in museums behind the scenes, the so-called name-bearing holotype specimens that have come up quite a bit at this conference. By contrast, Nessie received her Latin name from a handful of murky photographs taken by automatic cameras stationed deep in the waters of Loch Ness. Under both US and UK law, a species must be known and named to receive legal protection, which makes some intuitive sense. As Matthew said, how can you save something if you don't know what it is you're saving? What's perhaps less obvious, however, is that in order for an animal species to be known and to be named, some of its members must first be sacrificed and laid to rest in museums, save for rare exceptions. I think that has become second nature to all of us in this room who are familiar with natural history collections, but I would suggest it's actually not an obvious metaphysics. Scott and Rines, at least on the surface, seem to question this paradigm, citing the ethical implications of collecting specimens of a species in danger of extinction, in their words. They wondered if taxonomists should open their minds to photographs and other evidence beyond corpses. To what extent, they asked in the paper, if any, does scientific curiosity justify risking that most irrevocable biological occurrence, the extermination of a species? The outcry that would now be raised by any attempt to kill a Loch Ness monster for any purpose whatsoever can be well imagined, end quote. With her name preemptively in place, the paper reasoned, any Nessie encountered in the flesh need not be slaughtered, simply to appear on the scientific map. Now, there's been some debate about whether this was all a big joke, and the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, we have Luis here being our resident commissioner, now says that this is an invalid name because it describes a mythological being. But even if Scott and Rines did name Nessie in jest, the words of George Saunders would still apply. Humor is what happens when we're told the truth quicker and more directly than we're used to. The naming of Nessie touches on a central tension in the history of natural history. Animals must be killed to be studied, killed to be known, killed to be saved, killed to be loved. It also highlights an abiding reality in the history of museums and collecting more broadly. While museums preserve things, creatures, artifacts, cultural heritage, shards of historical memory we dare not lose, they also by nature destroy. The museum is not just the reliquary that nostalgia and tireless conservators make it out to be. It is also the angel of death, the grim reaper waiting at the door. Drawing from historical research and on-the-ground interviews, my new book project, The Collector's Paradox, excavates the surprising 300-year history of collecting that led to this Janus face of the modern museum. And although the book is really in its infancy and its shape is changing in my mind by the day, I currently envision it as a meditation on death, sentiment, ethics, science, and love, and their centuries-long struggle within the walls of collections. So we begin today with Nessie, Not because she became a specimen, but because she never did. To millions, she's hinted at imagined worlds that could have been. What kind of fabulous museum might her story foretell? I think there's a book-long answer to that question that we won't be able to fully answer today, but I think to begin to answer that question, we have to go back to before the beginning, before the study of humans and animals were separate, before the Met or AMNH or the MCZ existed, before holotype specimens were even a formalized concept or practice. We have to go back to the early modern world. And I'd like to focus today on a museum that has received scant scholarly attention, the Curiosity Cabinet of Dartmouth College, which definitely has some resonances with the MHS collection, and it was stationed on Abenaki land. Again, déjà vu. The first object to enter its collection was this mastodon molar, donated in 1772 by the Reverend David McClure. It's actually one of the only surviving artifacts from this early collection. The tooth, big as a gourd, we learned about from Victor today, and it was an object lesson in extinction, though the likes of Thomas Jefferson refused to believe it at the time. And this item was one of many embodiments in Dartmouth's museum of that elemental struggle between preservation and annihilation. Along with the molar, McClure also sent, quote, human bones picked up on Braddock's Field, which could be gathered like seashells by those who wandered this battle site of the 7 Years' War. Over the next few decades, objects continued to populate the museum of this backwater woodland college in a steady march, eventually taking up quarters in a narrow room on the 3rd floor of Dartmouth Hall. By the time keepers made a formal inventory of its contents around 1810, the museum's contrasts were sharp, its holdings global. There were many animals, a pearl shell from the East Indies, a lone wolf from just down the road turned into taxidermy, a penguin, a flamingo, and there was a zebra. It actually became kind of a campus celebrity. There were vegetables and minerals, even the natural marvel of asbestos. But there were also people and the stories and ruins they left behind. There were things of the old world, like marble from the Temple of Serapis and petrified wine from Herculaneum. There were things from so-called New Worlds, a Cherokee pipe, the feathered robe of a Hawaiian priest, and many more generically Indian items. As with all museums of this era, marks of violence, that tension between preserving and destroying, simmered under the surface of Dartmouth's early collection. For example, just the rostrum or beak of a sawfish appears on the inventory. Every good curiosity cabinet of the day had to have one of these on display, and the rapacious collection of these gentle rays didn't do their population numbers any favors, as they're some of the most endangered fish in the world today. Nearly every animal body or body part in the museum had a bloody story behind it, now mostly lost to history. Other descriptions of the collection are more forthright, however, like a bird that was, quote, put on a hook and sunk for 2 hours. In fact, destruction was one of the guiding themes of this museum, made evident by things like a piece of hull perforated by shipworm, a mollusk that ravaged the wood of naval fleets, or chunks of lava from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Perhaps the most salacious variation on this theme was a 4-inch knife that a New Hampshire man named Josiah Burnham used to kill his 2 fellow inmates while they all languished together in debtor's prison. Before it made its way to the museum through the High Sheriff, the knife that Burnham used to commit the murders was used to cut the rope that was holding up the platform under his feet as he stood at the gallows, effectively causing his death. Something like Burnham's knife, then, contained within it a story and a warning. Museums were forces of destruction, and they preserved stories of destruction. Objects recorded violence, and they enacted it. Yet despite the many erasures involved in this museum, it also left room for creation. Line 375 of that inventory listed a hornet's nest presented by Ignatius Neal, an Indian charity youth. Ignatius was a student at a place called Moore's Charity School, which was a grammar school for Native youth envisioned as a kind of feeder school into Dartmouth College, and it was a long-standing project of Dartmouth's founder and first president, Eleazar Wheelock. Ignatius came from Oka, a mission village near Montreal, known to Europeans as Lake of Two Mountains. His father, who's identified in scrawling letters simply as an Algonquin chief, appears from my genealogical research to be Chief Penezi, who would go on to become Grand Chief of the Algonquins. Dartmouth was an Indian college from day one. It was designed with the express intent of educating Native youth as Christian missionaries, something stated explicitly in its royal charter, although the college has so often failed spectacularly to fulfill its original mission. For example, until 1970, only 20 Indigenous students graduated from Dartmouth. A museum like Dartmouth's then differed in this regard from the wonder cabinets of Europe, where Native people might be represented by a curious basket, or an ingenious canoe, or a fearsome weapon. Most European creators of and visitors to Wunderkammern would never meet an Indigenous North American. By contrast, Native people were neighbors, peers, spouses, and children of Euro-Americans in the New World. And in Dartmouth's specific case, despite all of its missteps, they were active participants in the making of the college and its museum. Scores of Native people helped furnish early American museums with artifacts. Sometimes objects arrived via diplomatic exchange. Sometimes they arrived through trade. So Haida and other Northwest Coast peoples curated New England museums from afar by deciding which objects would enter the hands of mariners and make their way back to those collections. Yet Ignatius's donation is unusual for several reasons. First of all, he was still a child. He was around 12 years old when he arrived, and he made the donation not long after that. Dartmouth students or recent alums who made donations were considerably older. Second, he is the only Native donor on Dartmouth's list who is explicitly named and called out as Indigenous. In fact, it was quite rare for these early museum inventories to pay homage to named individual Native donors in this manner. Native communities were intimately involved in the collection and supply of objects, but their labor was typically invisible. That's been a real refrain of this conference. Finally, the content of his donation merits remark. In these early museums, most Indigenous objects stood out as recognizably, conspicuously, even stereotypically Indigenous. Take, for example, things like moccasins or a sachem's cap in Dartmouth's museum. Instead, Ignatius donated a scientific curiosity. Now, Native people themselves, of course, were brutally made into artifacts and scientific curiosities against their will in this period, through warfare, through death, and through grave robbing. The American Philosophical Society, where we're standing today, received its own, quote, skin of an Indian from George Turner in 1797. Today, more than 100,000 remains of Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Alaska Natives languish in museums, and the remains of Native ancestors have been used in Dartmouth classrooms, unbeknownst to students, as late as 2023. These cabinets also presented carefully woven narratives of Native destruction and decline through other means. Here again, weaponry loomed large. For example, a donation to the American Philosophical Society, once again by George Turner in 1797, of a spear that was, quote, used by the savages in killing Colonel Chew on the Ohio, seems to ring a bell with Josiah Burnham's murder knife. It's a subtle difference, but Native American weaponry took on quite specific meanings in early museums. Every historical artifact, writes Mohawk scholar Scott Manning Stevens in his brilliant study of the tomahawk's history, quote, carries the burden of providing a sort of mute testimony about the culture that made it. And this is especially the case with Native American artifacts, end quote. For one, someone like Josiah Burnham was named, not called a generic savage. And in addition to recent Native weaponry, Dartmouth also featured archaeological implements, as with 2 stone axes found in Connecticut. placing native artifacts like those axes alongside, say, a plundered tile from the floor of an ancient Greek temple sent the message that fallen societies belonged in the museum. Overemphasizing weaponry, especially stone tools, cast their creators as intrinsically warlike savages, primitive, uncivilized, and at odds with modernity. And this wasn't a one-off, but really a widespread and pointed rhetorical strategy of museums and colonial writers. Eleazar Wheelock, while leading what was intended to be a college for Native youth, wrote despondently of the Haudenosaunee, quote, "They are wasting like a morning dew." So why, of all things, would Ignatius donate a hornet's nest? He may have donated it because he found it curious. Maybe it was really big. Or maybe he visited the college museum not long after his arrival, saw its dazzling sawfish and penguin, and determined to leave his mark on it with an item of naturalia he felt would be at home among the ostrich eggs and flying fish. Native students at Moores and at Dartmouth felt the weight of tremendous scrutiny for their behavior, even at such a vulnerable age, as many were just young children, and so removed from their families and communities. After Yale's president, Timothy Dwight, visited Dartmouth, he wrote of the challenges of educating Native youth through the figure of a rhetorical hopeless Indian. Quote, "His habits are in great measure fixed before he can be brought to a place of education, and more resemble those of a deer or fox than those of civilized youth. In the literal sense, he must be tamed, and to tame him is scarcely possible. To engraft literature and science on such a stock, few employments have been more hopeless than this." So this is the sort of ingrained prejudice and colonial fatalism that Ignatius and other early Dartmouth and Moore students were up against. They were described as subhuman, as literal animals in stock, difficult to subdue. Perhaps better to donate a scientific specimen than become one. In conclusion, in Dartmouth's collection, we see a microcosm of the idea of a museum as it once was, and as, in certain respects, it was going to be. That cosmic tug of war between permanence and loss haunted its holdings and those of other proto-museums before the 19th century. These early memory palaces set off cycles of violence and loss that museums would inherit forever after. This past was a foreign land, but it is where museums begin. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be presenting on my research, Zoopolitical Syncretism, the role of the Beijing Zoo in the PRC's projection of state ideology and nationalism after 1949. It's interesting. I feel like hearing the previous two presentations, my research actually has a lot of sort of similarities with a lot of what Matthew was talking about in terms of the presentation of nature and nationalism, albeit through a non-Western lens. I know that my research topic on the program actually states that the title of my presentation will be on zoological nationalism, but as I continued developing my research further, I noticed that the Beijing Zoo did much more than simply bolster nationalism through its animal exhibits, for it also aided in the propagation of Chinese socialist ideologies. Hence, I've decided to sort of retitle my presentation today to Zoopolitical Syncretism to highlight the multifaceted ways in which the Beijing Zoo interweaved zoology with nationalism, politics, and socialist ideology. I'll start today by explaining what got me interested in the history of the Beijing Zoo in the first place. When I first started looking at the historiography on animal history during the Maoist era as a Chinese environmental historian, I noticed that there was an overwhelming emphasis on the general insensitivity and callousness the public had towards animals during that time. This is a quote I found from a recent book by scholar Peter Lee discussing animal welfare in China, where he argues that being nice to animals was frowned upon because of its possible bourgeois connotations during the Maoist era. He believed that animals were not of significant concern to the Maoist era because the state was more concerned to build efforts for a socialist economy, which, in his opinion, rendered animals an insignificant concern. This to me seemed at odds with the existence of the Beijing Zoo. How can a state justify building a literal sanctuary for animals if, generally speaking, they believed that more efforts should be placed on building a socialist economy that had no time for animal welfare? My research, hence, attempts to answer this question by suggesting that generalizations like these seem slightly too simplistic, in my opinion, and that the zoo with its animal exhibits, also aided in its own unique ways in the construction of a strong socialist economy and aided in bolstering nationalism for Chinese development. Through my analysis, I define zoopolitical syncretism as the interweaving of the Beijing Zoo's depiction of fauna and the social political imperatives that shaped China after 1949. Specifically, I want to suggest today that the Beijing Zoo's leadership and the CCP try to strategically use the Beijing Zoo to blend zoological education with the nation's communist socialist imperatives. I suggest that they emphasize the unique Chineseness of certain indigenous animals presented at the zoo, intertwining their zoology with Chinese culture and history to reinforce Chinese nationalism through the zoo's exhibits. This deliberate association of certain species with geographic, cultural, and historical distinctiveness underscored the uniqueness of Chinese identity through the global framework of zoos. The Beijing Zoo's role in encapsulating this fusion of zoology with socialist ideology and animal biology with national heritage to foster nationalism constitutes what my paper coins zoopolitical syncretism. Before I start discussing the ways in which the Beijing Zoo effectively propagated its ideologies and bolstered nationalism, I want to situate our discussion of the history of the Beijing Zoo with a historical anecdote that I think effectively highlights the political nature of the zoo from the very beginning. In October of 1949, Chairman Mao declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China at Tiananmen Square, a center where over 200,000 people gathered to hear the great chairman's pronouncement of liberation. Just 10 kilometers northeast of the square, however, laid a very different site, a space of destruction. The remains of the agricultural and forestry experimental zone, an animal botanical field that would later be retitled as the Beijing Zoo in 1954 by the CCP, were, according to zoo directors, desolate and cold. Of the remaining animals still alive at the site were apparently 3 parrots, 13 monkeys, and an emu that was allegedly blind. After years of destructive civil war, Japanese imperialism, and continuous name changes to the park due to changing party rulership, the agricultural experimental zone was in a state of neglect. As the CCP declared itself the sole legitimate governing body of a newly unified nation-state in 1949, the central government began channeling resources to rebuild China's various cultural institutions and to further adapt them within the CCP's social-ideological narratives. To this end, the CCP paid increasing attention to the resurrection of the destroyed agricultural zone with the intention of transforming the space into a large-scale zoo. In linking the survival of the zoo to the reconstruction efforts of the CCP, the party used the zoological space to propagate its political messages and state propaganda. In 1953, to repopulate the zoo with animals, Chairman Mao and Commander-in-Chief Juda donated their war horses used during the Chinese Civil War to the park's grassland animal garden for exhibition. To help visitors understand the significance of these war horses, the CCP set up explanatory boards to accompany the exhibition based on historical materials introduced by the Administrative Office of the CCP Central Committee. This curated exhibition of these war horses, which directly valorized the CCP's war efforts, ascribed the zoo a new meaning and function, a nationalistic exhibition of fauna imbued with political symbolisms. In essence, the CCP co-opted the zoo in 1953 as a political theater to illustrate its contribution to national liberation, transforming the space through the use of animals into a propagandistic spectacle to exalt the CCP's prowess. Hence, the discourse surrounding the zoo after liberation in 1949 carried a zoopolitical undertone that supported its existence. Outside of the literal presentation of war horses that served political purposes, I want to discuss the ways in which the Beijing Zoo interweaved zoology, specifically the presentation of animals, with China's socialist communist imperatives. I suggest that the zoo amplified China's socialist ideologies and imperatives in 2 ways. Firstly, the zoo deliberately amplified the utilitarian and economic value of animals exhibited at the zoo for public education, specifically to educate people on the ways in which these animals can benefit or harm Chinese agricultural development. Secondly, the zoo also highlighted the importance of an educational mindset that valued objective, grounded, and empirical rationality. This was one of Mao's main conundrums in his work on contradictions, where he agonized about the ways to prioritize objective realities of Chinese conditions over traditional thought and the straight adherence to Marxist theories. During the era of the first 5-year plan, between 1953 to 1957, the zoo's mission was to educate the public about the diverse roles of animals in Chinese ecosystems, aligning animal management with the needs of agriculture, forestry, and husbandry. This educational mission positioned the zoo as a transformative space where visitors could learn more about the practical applications of zoology, contributing significantly to the ideological landscape of socialist China. In the Beijing Zoo Manual, published in 1956, intended to be a manual guide for visitors at the Beijing Zoo, the editors of the manual advocated a fusion of zoology with socialist educational goals. For instance, the Beijing Zoo director's description of animals like civets and foxes revealed how they used the zoo to blend zoological education with practical economic insights, emphasizing the animal's value for both scientific understanding and their utility in furthering the goals of agricultural development. In discussing civets, they address the utilitarian aspects of civets, noting that in addition to the great economic value of civet perfumes, their skin can also be used economically, and because they are hazardous to domestic animals, they should be vigorously hunted. It's interesting to think about descriptions like these in zoo manuals when you're traveling and visiting zoos, and this suggestion to hunt these animals exhibited in front of you suggests the irony of the Beijing Zoo. As much as the zoo was intended to bolster public fascination and love for these animals, the zoo directors ultimately saw these animals as means for agricultural and human development. In describing foxes, not only did they highlight the economic value of foxes in Inner Mongolia for their fur, but they also urged Chinese farmers to reevaluate their hatred for these exhibits, suggesting that foxes like to steal chicken and ducks, so farmers regard foxes as a thorn in their eyes. In fact, foxes hunt many rats and hares every year, which is extremely beneficial to agriculture. These discussions highlight their advocacy for reevaluating wildlife through the exhibits at the Beijing Zoo, encouraging visitors not only to passively witness the animals for entertainment, but also to learn their possible contributions to economic development. Beyond demonstrating how animals displayed at the zoo could benefit Chinese agricultural development, the zoo editors also framed the Beijing Zoo as a contributor to Maoist socialism by effectively exemplifying and championing a way of thinking that countered traditionalism, emphasizing rational application and objective empiricism, principles Mao personally upheld for Chinese socialist development. In the manual, the zoo directorates also emphasized the zoo's role in encouraging hands-on learning through direct interactions with the zoo's diverse inhabitants, which transcended traditional classroom boundaries by providing students with a dynamic and immersive educational experience. Their belief in the zoo as an education medium that focused on learning that did not rely mostly on books, but instead on nature and rationality, would parallel Mao's later quote in 1957, where he noted, "Reading is learning, but applying is also learning and the more important kind of learning." In this sense, the Beijing Zoo, by urging visitors to learn zoology through objective observation of exhibits, highlighted the importance of practical application and empirical investigation, blending the display of animals with an empirical socialist mindset. This idea was echoed by other CCP party members as well. CCP party member Zhou Jianyuan similarly exalted the role of the zoo in delineating a didactic strategy and promoting a respect for factual accuracy, attributes he saw indispensable for the advancement of the socialist cause. In thanking the Beijing Zoo, he saw the zoo as important to cultivate the thought and style of dealing with things realistically. Therefore, the Beijing Zoo, as articulated by these CCP members, transcended its conventional educational mandate, positioning itself as an instrumental agent in the ideological reorientation of the populace. By facilitating direct encounters with the natural world, the zoo served as a tangible interface for the application of Maoist principles of realism. As we delve deeper into the multifaceted role of the Beijing Zoo, it becomes evident that the institution did more than just educate. It played a pivotal role in promoting Chinese nationalism and cultural pride. This was particularly apparent in how CCP commentators and zoo directors highlighted the distinctiveness of certain species, using the zoo as a symbol of national identity. I suggest here that the zoo highlighted the unique Chineseness of animals through emphasizing the endemic nature of certain animals to China proper, and the use of history and cultural traditions to suggest the long-standing associations of these animals to China. For example, certain newspaper commentators in 1956 highlighted the national significance of these animals by referencing historical and fossil records, presenting these animals as living symbols of China's extensive natural history. The exhibit of pandas serves as a good example for this. By referencing fossil records that these commentators claim trace the panda's presence in China back hundreds of thousands of years, zoo commentators not only presented these animals as biological entities, but as timeless symbols of the Chinese wilderness. In examining the Beijing Zoo's use of historical associations, it becomes clear how the past is leveraged to amplify the zoo's national significance. These historical ties are not just mere footnotes, but they are narratives that link the present to an ancient past, portraying these creatures as enduring participants in China's long-standing natural heritage. This deep-rooted connection is used to strengthen the bond between the Chinese people and their land, framing these animals as living relics of the nation's history and reinforcing a collective identity rooted in a shared ancient past. The zoo also incorporated traditional Chinese symbols into its exhibits, blending mythology and Chinese folklore with zoological education to create a culturally immersive experience. Further enriching the cultural tapestry of the Beijing Zoo are the traditional symbols woven into its exhibits, which merge Chinese ancient mythology with contemporary scientific understanding. For instance, CCP member Zhou Jianyan's discussion of lizards displayed at the Beijing Zoo highlights this point. Zhou suggested that this exhibit did more than showcase a reptile. It evoked the image of the dragon, a potent symbol in Chinese culture representing power, strength, and good fortune. This symbolic linkage is not accidental, but a deliberate effort to connect visitors with traditional Chinese values through the lens of zoology. Similarly, other newspaper commentators suggested that zoo officers described the cranes exhibited at the zoo as relics depicted in Chinese art and poetry, which historically symbolize longevity and peace. This association of animals exhibited with their role as inspirations for ancient Chinese art not only educated visitors about the species, but also highlighted their significance in Chinese folklore. These animals, like lizards and cranes, were presented not merely as creatures to observe, but as cultural icons that embody the values and narratives of Chinese civilization, transforming a simple visit to the zoo into a journey through China's rich cultural landscape. In conclusion, through the concept of zoopolitical syncretism, the Beijing Zoo was a stage where animals played out intricate narratives of national pride, political identity, and ideological education. This syncretism enabled the CCP to weave zoological education with socialist development, redefining the traditional zoo as an educational platform for communist ideals. The deliberate association of indigenous animals with national identity underscored the CCP's intent to root China's political narratives in its unique cultural and environmental heritage, marking the zoo as an example of China's broader state-building ambitions. The zoo became a conduit through which the CCP projected its aspirations for national rejuvenation and modernity. Linking the presentation back to the theme of the panel, collecting past and future, the Beijing Zoo, in my opinion, also stood as an example of temporal liminality, a space where the imperatives of future socialist development and the romanticization of the past through the exhibition of animals coalesce and merge. The Beijing Zoo, thus, stood as a vivid example of the transformative potential of zoological spaces in shaping national identity and ideology, both echoing the past and shaping people's perception for future development. The Beijing Zoo serves as a unique case study in how zoos can embody the social political imperatives of their times, turning fauna into living symbols of a nation's aspirations, ideologies, and cultural identity. Thank you.
I just like to take a second and say thanks for the labor of both conference participants and also organizers. Really grateful to be here. And I now have the kind of difficult task of transitioning us from these illuminating conversations about the past into one about the future. I turn to the results of the collecting and the expeditions that we've explored over the last 2 days, and into one of the consequences of those, accumulation. Within the Natural History Museum, knowledge is produced through the keeping and comparing of accumulated specimens. Yet accumulation, a defining feature of both capitalism and collections, is costly. In 2018, the state of Berlin and the Bundestag awarded 660 million euros to support the largest German natural history institution's proposal for a Zukunftsplan, or future plan. At present, Berlin's Museum for Naturkunde, or MFN, is under construction in order to meet the infrastructure goals laid out in this plan by 2030, including building repairs, additional storage infrastructure, and the movement of specimens off-site as a way to embody modernization. Indeed, MFN's public materials regarding the future plan highlight the proposed infrastructure developments as a way for MFN to become a, quote, role model for the Natural History Museum of the 21st century, end quote. In this presentation, I'll explore portrayals of infrastructure and storage within MFN's future plan in order to better understand the logics of accumulation and preservation which maintain the Natural History Museum today. As I move through the outlined topics, I'll offer questions that have arisen during my current residency at MFN. I'll first share a bit more about the future plan and its intended impacts on storage infrastructure. I'll then explain the plan's impact on perceptions of collection utility and talk a bit about the problems of accumulation. While exhibitionary displays at museums more often receive critical attention, the future plan makes clear the disproportionate cost of storage infrastructures. 2/3 of future plan funding, approximately 400 million euros, will be spent on building renovations. Around 107 million of that will go towards the construction of off-site storage for specimens just outside of Berlin. If we follow James Delborgo to suspend the assumption that storage is a pragmatic, colorless, and transparently utilitarian activity, then we should consider the development of storage infrastructures as a commitment to asserting collection functionality and usefulness. The expansion of conservation-focused facilities remains a performance of authority over collection futures, asserting their continued usefulness as reservoirs. Expanding and repairing storage facilities allows MFN to publicly demonstrate a commitment to preservation, as well as an optimism about the stability of conditions required for long-term collection maintenance. The plan requires improved storage in order to utilize collections as long-term, quote, research infrastructure. In this context, storage is able to transform collections into a kind of infrastructure that is supposed to support researchers in their attempts to address the myriad problems of modernity, particularly the normatively positive targets of biodiversity. Yet considering natural history collection storage as infrastructure also allows us to frame accumulation as a means of amassing capital through the maintenance of specimens' future and present use value. If, as in the Nachtsammlung exhibition shown above, storage's intentional display functions as a signal of quantity, then storage framed as research infrastructure can be a signal for the capacity to make use of objects across temporalities. Although the innocence of museum storage depends on its sterility, this quality is bound up in disciplinary regimes of power. Scholars such as Katarina Madruga and Deborah Dorwaldt have pointed out that accumulating natural history specimens was a project of resource extraction, which delegitimized non-extractive ecological relationships in order to amass scientific, cultural, and economic value. Repairs to infrastructures of containment should remind us of their function, maintaining the conditions for extracting multiple kinds of value from specimens over time. These categories of value can be overlapping. As we have seen from the last 2 days, an object which is determined to have scientific value can also be determined to have historic and thus national value. Taking value to mean a positive determination of worth, this might lead to the objection that perceptions of value are culturally or socially particular and not necessarily congruent. Yet it is precisely the assertion that collections have undefined or uncapped potential value which justifies their preservation by institutional and national entities. For both governing scientific bodies and the German state, conceptions of value are correlated with collections' usefulness as reservoirs. Museums across Europe tend to reflect a logic of rescue, removing objects from their context as these contexts are allegedly rapidly and uncontrollably eroding under the influence of modernization. Following this logic, the safest course of action would be to remove, preserve, and keep materials deemed inert in order to produce knowledge about what was, as well as what might be. With regard to this rescue paradigm in European collection contexts, Rebecca Habermas has situated the collection, accumulation, and, quote, preservation fetishism, quote, of objects as tied up with the formation of European identity under modernity. Thus, debates about what the museum should be entitled to hold on to are also debates about the moral authority of a mission to preserve. Storage infrastructure performs an extension of the Natural History Museum's power over extracted specimens, despite processes of decay already haunting collections. Within Western intellectual traditions, rot and decay have had negative connotations, that of waste, immorality, and inattention. This positions the labor of preservation and those infrastructures which enable it as rot's opposite morally and materially. Yet, as Martha Fleming has written, colonial technologies enabled and enable the assembly of European collections. The colonialism of German natural history museums is not isolated to infamous objects or even to a set of objects transported from colonial holdings, such as those from the violent 1909 through 1913 Tendaguru expedition in so-called German East Africa, today Tanzania. Colonial wealth enabled the growth and development of collecting infrastructures and colonial technologies in the metropole, meaning that state-funded institutions such as MFN are implicated across both collections and processes of knowledge production. Museum storage is both a demonstration of commitment to and a technology of preventative conservation. Given the future plan's attempt to transform collections into research infrastructure, the stability and permanence of collected specimens becomes paramount to their having value. This has had material impacts on storage construction. It was originally determined that 5 underground floors would be needed to accommodate the massive collections at MFN, but advisors cautioned that this plan could leave the entire collection vulnerable to a single natural disaster. Instead, the collections will be split between off-site storage and the 2 underground floors partially seen above at MFN's main site, which will complement proposed updated research laboratories, refurbished offices, and expanded exhibition space. The so-called modernization of the future plan is thus equated with increased functionality of collections. The production of scientific, cultural, or historical value from specimens by as yet undetermined future technologies and strategies is prioritized within today's storage development. This emphasis obscures the potential of apparently unproductive futures for specimens, including decay or restitution, affirming preservation fetishism instead. The museum must be physically rearranged and repaired to accommodate the accumulation, which has engendered its social, political, and scientific status, even as the volume of accumulated objects reveals spatial limitations. Thus, a simultaneous sense of overflow and scarcity animate the museum's infrastructure proposal. Museum storage capacity embodies what Nikki Reeves refers to as a deferred promise of value, one which necessitates the institution's management of collections in the time between now and when that value can be fully realized. By funding a 10-year future plan, the assertion of natural history collections as valuable to German cultural, historic, and scientific identity does not assert a fixed definition of what value collections provide. Instead, it asserts that through the ongoing management of collections, presently undefined types of value might be produced into the future, an idea which Johanna Radin has referenced as the concept of planned hindsight. When considering the role of colonialism in producing these collections, questions of ongoing value extraction from specimens by former colonial powers becomes even more ethically fraught. Collections are national assets whose transformation into heritage must therefore be legible to the nation state, leading to an emphasis on accountable iterations of value, such as collection size, storage costs, and visitor numbers. Thus, accumulation continues to define the museum's storage needs. Even as storage is made and remade in order to contain expanding collections, it produces new inabilities, a reminder that spatial relationships are always also projects of failure and breakdown. Where breakdown is not allowed to occur, as in the case of preserved specimens, it delimits relational knowledge. With more than 30 million specimens, MFN possesses the largest natural history collections in Germany, and it is one of the most visited museums in Berlin. Many departments of MFN are still actively collecting, to the tune of 120,000 total objects per year, and deacquisitions within natural history museums remain incredibly uncommon. When I asked a collection manager about MFN's deacquisition process for vertebrate specimens, I was first told that there was no protocol, and then that deacquisitions were actually so rare that there was a process, but it wasn't worth explaining. Later, I learned that collection objects at MFN are only permanently removed in exceptional cases, including decay or mishandling that damages scientific potential, disjunction with the museum's collection policies, ethical concerns, or successful repatriation cases. Caught between the directives for preservation and accumulation, the Natural History Museum thus becomes a site which can only amass, overflow, and then amass again. Yet across the museum sector, diminishing resources and continually increasing collections are leading to an openness to deacquisitioning. A 2018 survey through the Heritage Futures Research Project found that social history museum practitioners' most pressing concern was simply space. While the 2023 UK Museums Association conference featured multiple talks about the environmental, ethical, and economic costs of preservation. Rather than reverting to a neoliberal economization of space in order to critique practices of accumulation, We might ask what role storage infrastructures cast specimens into, and what the ontological consequences are of figuring specimens as resources for imagined future and technological scientific development to be visited upon. The future plan's aesthetic, numerical, and verbal descriptions, such as the projection above, construct an image of the future in which repair has been completed and full use has been restored to both buildings and specimens. In that this image assumes productive future use of infrastructure, it is typical of projections done across the heritage sector, where conservation is allegedly done on behalf of either future actors or technological developments, yet these are not regularly scrutinized. In the long term or even near future, actions like the future plan will become the same historically situated actions as we have explored over the last 2 days, which determine how collections can be used. Accumulation, ownership, and even specimens themselves are culturally mediated and ethically fraught concepts. How might a storage system materially structured around these concepts impact future relationships between humans and non-humans? Storage is the physical infrastructure which makes possible increased debates around museums and their collections. I set out to contribute an analysis of the politics involved in using infrastructure, modernity, and futurity as mutually reinforcing concepts that justify the use of public funds for collection preservation. Yet in turning towards the physicality of the museum structure, I, like many others, became transfixed by the sheer volume of what it holds, as well as how an infrastructure plan can reference the normatively progressive valences of a term like modernization, even as it builds on colonially accumulated value. From my standpoint as a queer feminist researcher, it is critical to affirm disruptions to the colonial rhythms that establish these sites of authority and accumulation. These disruptions will occur both with and without human help, decay and material release, the surfacing of our own histories within those of the specimens we care for, and the strengthening of shared relations. With regard to this last aspect, I want to end my brief talk about accumulation and containment with an image of a poppy plant growing out near the museum parking lot that has just begun to flower last week. This poppy, as well as some nearby yarrow, grow on and with museum infrastructures, yet they are not contained by it. I draw from the intuition of this mutual relationship, as well as thinkers like Jesse Cohen, to remind myself of the ways that modernity's logic both beguiles and entraps. He writes that one of modernity's ideological articles of faith is that there is but one path to futurity, and that it runs through modernity. This is cruel because it forecloses imagination of other futures, and impossible because it offers more of the same, continuing the project of extraction infinitely on a finite earth. We within museums are in desperate need of infrastructures that will allow us to consider what we owe, to those from whom the specimens were extracted, to each other, and to the materials themselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. That was an amazing last section of this conference. And after a day and a half of all our discussions and ending with this one, this is my question to you all. So we have collected the natural world for many different reasons throughout time, preserved specimens, animals, information in many different ways, and infused these collections with humans' need to control, conquer, and prevail above all else. In doing this, we have caused destruction of what we have tried to preserve and minimized or erased the contributions of those we deemed disposable. This is our past and what we have discussed throughout this conference. So as we look to the future, as scholars and stewards and laborers of this work, what does the future hold? What is our responsibility?
I guess I can start. I think the future of the museum as a single concept is hard to articulate because museums are so various. There are museums underwater. There's one in Antarctica. So I can maybe specifically speak, since I was talking about anthropology and human remains. There have been recent revisions to NAGPRA at the end of last year that I think have done important work to put kind of the ultimate authority in the hands of tribes and Native communities, even moving beyond just a kind of collaboration, but actually looking at putting especially human remains, but other sacred artifacts too, back into communities. So I think working with tribes, and there's a 5-year deadline essentially for organizations who fall under NAGPRA, who hold such objects, to work with communities to repatriate those objects. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement in the next couple of years that I think won't be without hiccups. 5 years is really a short amount of time to do that work sensitively and correctly. And I know even though some of these changes have been embraced, I think they've also been met with some mixed feelings and caution from some tribal leaders, because there's a kind of hot potato mentality almost with Native artifacts kind of treated as damaged goods in a way that is offensive. And so I think there needs to be time for those sensitive community conversations to take place. But I don't think the transit of museums or the transit of objects out of museums on its own should necessarily be a cause for panic. I think when things leave the museum, a lot of knowledge and reconciliation and new knowledge through community partnerships can be gained as well. So that's just one facet of a really big question.
I don't know if I could add too much more. I mean, I think that's a great response. I think it's important that museums are democratized and become collaborative, and it's important that we think about how things were collected and what they mean, and I think that one of the ways that democracy works is through education. So we need a collaboration between scientists, experts, various kinds of scholars, and people more generally, arrayed in particular communities with particular interests, sometimes with proprietary interests over the materials in the museum itself. And sometimes, their interest, often their interests should prevail over those of a kind of mere science. And I say that very, respectfully. But it's really going to be dependent on particular situations, and I think discussions and dialogue are really important. No matter what the outcome is, having this kind of conversation is very important, because as our society changes, as we change globally, the museums that represent knowledge, information and interpretation will have to vary as well.
I guess I can add slightly to that. I think my own research is very different, because I'm looking at the idea of environmental protection or the environment through the sort of Chinese communist lens in politics right now. And I agree with both your assertions about the importance of democratizing knowledge. I think one thing that I'm seeing right now in Chinese politics and sort of conversations about sustainability and environmentalism is also this sort of selective picking of history. We saw like last year with President Xi Jinping's statement during a convention on ecology, where he sort of doubled down on the idea of ecological civilization in China, and sort of similar to my research with the Beijing Zoo about the argument is that there's this sort of socialist Chinese understanding of sustainability, and that throughout Chinese civilization and millennia, there's been this sort of harmonious relationship between Chinese people and the environment, and that's sort of the way the CCP has sort of interpreted its environmental history to counter the West, right? Counter the Western capitalist. And I think these sort of selective case picking of history, or complete erasure of certain environmental atrocities that have happened throughout Chinese history is dangerous, and it's important to understand that a lot of talk conversations about environmental protection and sustainability can also be politicized, and depending on different contexts, and to identify it.
Yeah, so I suppose because mine is thinking explicitly about the future, and I do end on this point of the question of maybe what is owed within museums as a way to consider future infrastructures. I'd like to highlight that, the three aspects that I mentioned. So what is owed to those from whom the specimens were extracted? So I think this question allows us to return to the theme of labor, and to think about how, as historian and artist Martha Fleming has encouraged us, to think about collections as also sites from which reparations can be made, so we can understand better the histories of extraction as they are currently materially represented within collections. I also think the question of what is owed to one another, so I'm thinking of groups like Museum Detox in the UK who are working on issues of racial justice for museum staff, so thinking about the working conditions that museum staff and researchers are experiencing and also experimenting with and bringing into being, so how we can pursue questions about racial and disability justice within museum work settings, I think is also really critical. And then finally, to the materials themselves, which is, I'm very much looking forward now to Whitney's book. I think that, with regards to the specimens and viewing them as products of a process of labor and resource extraction, we might consider what is owed to the materials themselves. So trying to think with the specimens. For my purposes, I'm very interested in the material process of rot and decay as moments when the limits of the institution become very visible within specimens' bodies. And I think that this also might be an interesting site to continue looking at.
Thank you. Do we have questions from all of you?
I think we have time for one or two questions. Okay, we'll go. We're going to do new folks, I think. All right. I'll just pass it to you.
Thank you all for great papers. I think this is a question, and for anybody who cares to respond, or you can slap it down and say that doesn't make any sense. But in at least, let's see, we had talk about relics and symbols of ideology and fetishes. So there's a strong sort of religious connotation through many of these papers. But when Elaina said fetish, my mind went to Marx and thinking about commodity fetishism, where the idea is that the value inheres in the commodity and erases the labor that produced it. And this has been sort of a leitmotif of the whole conference, I think. So I'm wondering if you think that in your particular case studies, when an object becomes a relic, magical, sacred in some way, if we make these collections sacred, does that in and of itself do some of that work of erasing the labor and the value that got them into the collections in the first place and make it more difficult to deaccession?
Things that are relics are really hard to deaccession. But it's complicated because what makes them relic-like is can be kind of amorphous or kind of a grassroots sort of thing. It's how people relate to them, in my paper I talked about very particular sort of nationalist project, and then I think. Whitney has really talked about the dark side of that in interesting ways, and I talked about that too, but not in this particular paper. The way the connections that people have with these things is a kind of religious. It's kind of psychological. It's a very complicated process that I frankly don't know that I understand fully myself, but it seems to be real. The kind of relics I talk about. Sometimes natural historical objects, sometimes historical objects, have somehow been transformed from their ordinary or common qualities into something special. And so the power that they have, or the kind of aura they seem to have, will ebb and flow, and sometimes they will kind of self-destruct. They'll become less interesting or important to people, and other times they'll not be very important at all. All of a sudden, they'll kind of flare up in a way. So it's a process that I'm not sure I understand, very well, but it seems to be real, and in the eyes of the beholder, at least, because in these things they see the past embodied, and so it's kind of gives people, seems to give them a direct material connection where they experience the past in the present, and that past is one that's notable publicly, historically, and so that connection seems to endure. I mean, with like monuments. I mean, monuments are a little bit different, but they're constructed often by constituencies, and sometimes they actually give people the privilege of forgetting, because we've done our memory work, and then they become furniture in parks and pigeon roosts, and then all of a sudden someone says, "Oh my God, that person was horrible," and so then all of a sudden something that's anonymous becomes quite controversial, for good reason often, and then to not take it down is actually to erect it again. So we go through these kinds of historical processes, political, cultural processes that help determine where monuments or relics or museums more generally will operate. And so that's a very fraught and volatile terrain.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would add a bit to it. So you're talking about how the kind of aura, as you said, the almost religious quality that specimens or other objects can take on when they enter the museum. And I think that's absolutely true. I think in some of the cases I'm looking at, and the entry of an object into a museum can also kind of sever some spiritual ties. So I'm thinking of looking at this meteorite that's at the American Museum of Natural History called the Willamette meteorite. You wouldn't think a meteorite would be subject to this notion of the collector's paradox, right? If anyone's hurting anyone, it's the meteorite crashing into Earth that's hurting us. But actually, this particular meteorite is revered as a sacred being called Tamanaos to the Clackamas people in present-day Oregon. And so there was a NAGPRA suit against the American Museum of Natural History to try to get the meteorite out of the museum. The museum at the time was able to successfully argue that it was a feature of the natural landscape rather than a kind of spiritual being. It's not like a grave good, so it's a little bit harder to fit into the NAGPRA categories. It'll be interesting to see if that changes in the next couple of years, or if it already has. I haven't been to that museum recently. But what's interesting about its history, too, is the museum used to have a cast replica, but it is the aura of having the real specimen that keeps it in the museum, even as another aura has been severed. So they do have a really interesting relationship with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, where they'll come and do yearly ceremonies now with the meteorite. Rain used to fall into, it's a really weird looking meteorite. It looks like Swiss cheese, kind of. It has these divots, and so rainwater would pool in the divots, and they would dip their arrows in for strength. And so now they can do ceremonies within the museum, but it doesn't rain in the museum. So it is different, and I'll be interested to track what happens with that meteorite. Maybe it's not fully landed yet.
Can I just add that in my recent book, American Relics and the Politics of Public Memory, I have about a 10-page section on just that.
On the meteorite?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so if you want to read a little bit about it, you can that will whet your appetite, and then you can read Whitney's full-length description of it.
So I think, unless you wanted to respond to that, Bob Hauser also has one last question. So, but if you wanted to...
I'll just quickly respond to that. It's interesting that you talked about the sort of religious kind of like aura of these exhibits, because I visited the Beijing Zoo a couple months ago, and it was crazy to me when I saw the panda exhibit. It was impossible to get into because there was just huge amounts, and they also charge extra for you to see the panda. So you have to pay for a fare to get in, and then it's an extra cost to see the pandas. And you literally couldn't see them because it's just sort of like swarmed with people. And one thing that I noticed was also people were live streaming the pandas on TikTok in So I was talking to my friends and colleagues. I was like, this is sort of like a crazy worship following, sacred, this level of worship that they have for this animal. So that was sort of something that I thought was quite interesting as well.
I guess my question is relevant to what you just said, Sean, and that I wanted to ask about continued ideological and nationalist use by the PRC of animals, and specifically the pandas. I'm curious to know what you make of, so there were 3 events sort of potential interest. One was the gift of giant pandas to the National Zoo in DC. The other is, gift, loan. The other was when that loan was rescinded, so they had to be returned. And now the latest thing is that a couple more giant pandas are about to be shipped to the National Zoo. So what do you make of that?
I think that, well, as a historian, when I look at situations like this, I would say that this is not, some people think that this sort of animal diplomacy thing is like a very new thing throughout Chinese history. It's not really, because throughout, in imperial China, in terms of its tributary systems, like animals were traded back and forth a lot of the time for diplomatic reasons. I think that one interesting thing about the panda in this case is, it's interesting. I don't know why people like the pandas that much, and specifically what about them drive people crazy. But it is quite an interesting phenomenon, I think, that the CCP clearly is aware of and clearly is sort of leveraging. And this reminds me of like a funny anecdote in 1972 when Sino-American relations sort of like became better. And a lot of people don't know about this, but in the pandas being gifted to the United States was actually a response to the US gifting oxen to China in the first place. So this actually was a gift response to the United States. And for some reason, it was funny, I was reading through documents and George Bush was talking about how he felt like oxens were less sexy than pandas and they have to do better. Yeah, so it is interesting, this sort of political symbols that these animals carry. They almost become diplomats, right? And the zoos then, in my analysis of my paper further, I'm going to make an argument about how these zoos become like embassies, where these animals have extra protection in Maoist China because they represent sort of the friendly relations with different states and stuff. I hope that answered your question. I kind of went on a tangent there, but.
So I think, unfortunately, we have to close the session, but we'll have more time to chat at the reception. But for now, I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers for this really fantastic last session. And as we're applauding, I would like to invite our moderators who are still here to come to the stage. We're going to have a last quick little wrap-up conversation. I'm happy to reintroduce my colleague, Pedro Raposo, who's going to be moderating this session. And I'm going to get rid of these signs.
Hi, hello. So for those of you who were not at the Academy yesterday, so you didn't have the chance to get tired of me, I'm Pedro Raposo. I'm the Executive Director of the Librarian Archives at the Academy of Natural Sciences. And I want to take the opportunity to thank our friends here at the American Philosophical Society for inviting us to be part of this effort. And it's been truly delightful to be for us to have co-hosted this conference. It's a terrific couple of days with great discussions, great themes. I would also like to thank all the colleagues at the Academy who helped with making it a very special day at the Academy for us yesterday. Of course, everyone else at the APS contributed, and of course, all the speakers and the conference attendees who contributed to the discussions. Very quickly, so what I would like to invite my colleagues to do, mindful that we stand between you and the reception after a very long day, so notwithstanding your stretchings, but let's try to do this quickly. I would like to invite my colleagues just to think quickly about 2 or 3 things takeaways or main issues that they got out of the discussions and the conference in general over these couple of days that you feel compelled to continue to think about, or you felt, well, this really deserves more thinking, more research, There's more discussions being brought back to conference, etc. I'll very quickly share mine. I was thinking throughout these 2 days, maybe because I was chairing the first discussion yesterday, in which we had a very nice conversation about basically the two sides of this conference, I'll say. So there's the making nature and the labor that goes with it. And here we're talking about really unmaking it and putting our own labor in the understanding that labor that goes into the making nature. So I was always thinking about these two sides, what our historical actors were doing, were thinking, were feeling, and what we as scholars are doing, are feeling, are thinking. And so thinking of these two sides of the same coin of what we're doing here, there were three topics that I felt very compelling. One is what I thought was perhaps exhausted, but it's not apparently. It's this topic of objectivity and subjectivity. And it was truly delightful not just to hear throughout the papers that many of our presenters addressed how the historical actors dealt with that and their own objectivity and how that influenced their work and how, even very specific personal features, influenced the kind of work they did. But it was also interesting, for example, this morning to hear a plea for a feeling-free objective science being expressed clearly with very strong feelings about it, which makes me think that this is perhaps not about a tension or an opposition, might be about a continuum or even more about an interplay between the two. The other clearly is making things, connections, and importantly, people visible. I think this is, to me, one of the most fascinating topics that was present in most of the discussions, and how really we must continue to improve our methods, our approaches, our methodologies, and thinking how can we make the best possible use of the available sources, and what sources are not we yet using, what methods can we continue to use and use even better. I'm thinking about even using methods, current methods of data, visualization, etc., to go to historical sources and see things that are in there that are not immediately visible. So that, to me, was fascinating. And then the topic, if it was not the time of the day, and of course, the fact that you all are eager for the reception, I would love to comment at length, because it's very dear to my heart, is the topic of collecting. We talked we touched on so many important issues, ethics, purpose, meaning, relevance, the resources, the environmental impact, that go into what to collect, the stability and the instability of collections, accumulation and loss and destruction, etc. We talked a lot about collecting, but I always think, because I work with collections, with the library and an archive, I think about not just accumulating or collecting, but activating what are collections, what has been not just collected, what has been done with collections. And the big question to me is always, what are collections good for? No time to answer that, I guess, but continue to think, and I will hand it over to Anna now.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, this conference has brought up so many interesting directions, but I guess, one idea that emerged out of, I don't know if it was the first, I guess it was the first panel this morning, is this idea of, publications becoming these sort of very, very selective monuments that include only certain histories, and I'm thinking about Casey Stewart's work on John Bartram, and so digital tools being new ways that we can maybe fill in some of these gaps and create kind of fuller histories. But then ending today, the session today, thinking about sort of futurities, I guess it left me thinking, what's the future of the digital objects, and what can we do to ensure that these histories that are beyond sort of traditional publications as monuments, and that we've reconstructed with these digital tools, how can we ensure that those ideas kind of have a future and carry on to the futures? That was one thing that occurred to me this morning. And then, I mean, just a briefer comment, I think one really kind of poignant connection between the two papers, one from yesterday, Julie Kim's paper from yesterday on John Tiley, and then Marcy Norton's paper today on the Florentine Codex and Hernandez, just this idea of these sort of Easter eggs of resistance in these kind of publications, which are in many ways monuments to imperial power. I just found that really powerful and moving and very motivating for ways as a kind of way that we can think about continuing to reevaluate these objects that we think that we understand so well. So yeah.
I guess I would say I'm struck by the interdisciplinary nature of natural history, which does seem pretty obvious when you actually think about it, but how often do we really think about that? But it seems pretty obvious where I work at the Wagner Free Institute of Science, which is called an Institute of Science, but we do so much more there. We even recently had a space rock opera. We have visiting artists. We saw many presentations about artists incorporating natural history into their works, painting, poetry, literature. Scientists themselves use art and words to describe natural history, so it's exciting to see the field go even further into interdisciplinary subjects, and nationalism and politics, gender studies. Yeah, I think you can pretty much tie anything you want to the natural history. So I found that really exciting and illuminating throughout the conference.
If I just may quickly comment on that, when Adriana sent me the first draft of the call for papers, I thought, oh, this is great, but it's very broad. But I think what resulted out of that was really seemingly a centric set of papers generating wonderful discussions. And even Martin Heidegger's sneaked in at some point. That was remarkable.
Sure, I'll use this one. Okay, so we've heard about the interdisciplinary nature of natural history. So I was thinking a little bit about that, but also thinking about the interdisciplinary nature of the history of natural history, which I find really interesting. So full disclosure, my scholarly home, my first big book project is based in the 19th century Aotearoa, New Zealand. And for me, when I think of natural history, it has very clear connotations of things like abstraction, right, commodification, decontextualization, the opposite of anything that is ecological or anything like that. Right, it's about stripping objects of context, stripping away, myriad, contributions of, marginalized labor, whether that's women, right, whether that's servants, whether that's indigenous people, whether it's all kinds of actors that go into the making of natural history and the making of fortunes that arise from natural history, right, and the symbolism of imperial centers that are dedicated to these kinds of things, whether it's the New York Botanical Gardens or what have you. Now, the history of natural history is kind of, in some ways, the reverse of all of those things, right? It's about recovering the context that has been stripped away, right? It's about uncovering the labor that has gone into, that has been suppressed in publications and other places, right? We've heard about the labor of sailors, which is really interesting. We've heard about the labor of indigenous peoples who, in Marcy Norton's paper, were effectively co-authors, although that's not necessarily brought officially to the surface, right? And other myriad contributors, right? And also, this is also in the panel that I had the honor of moderating with the rhinoceros, right? This reinserting of living animals, right, and reconsidering them according to their ecological contexts. So this history of natural history is really rich for me, but it's also a really, it's very interesting partly because it's so interdisciplinary, because One of the striking things, and I say this as somebody who came of age sort of at the tail end of what were called the science wars, right, with humanists and scientists fighting it out, and who has epistemological authority over one another. And one of the things that struck me at this conference to some extent, but also in my own intellectual maturity, I spent some time at the New York Botanical Gardens, among other places, is the extent to which humanists and taxonomists, collection curators, folks sort of more on the natural sciences end of things, have found common cause, right, in historicizing natural history. And maybe it's interesting to think about why that is. Maybe it's the changing nature of natural history, which is now more about understanding things ecologically, right, understanding the inextricable connection between human cultures and non-human natures, and so on. But I think it's interesting, and it's really rich to think about. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can talk further.
So I guess as the person who organized this, I had a lot of things that I was interested in having come out of this conference, and you all did not disappoint. So thank you. But I guess I'll end just not so much with points, but with questions that remain for me. And one of the questions that I've been thinking about since really yesterday is what incentivizes natural history? And I think we've had lots of examples of answers to that question. So some being, imaginaries, the sublime, funding and infrastructure, national identity, notions of empire and commerce, commitments to science and biodiversity, commitments to collections and preservation, storytelling, experiential experiences. There you go. You can tell I'm tired. This sort of imperative of preservation for unknown future uses. Potential mechanisms for social and scientific transformation. I think transformation was a theme that really started to come out in that last session in particular. And then I think Whitney's really beautiful way of putting it, love. That there's this love of the natural world that even in all the dark and the decay and in the harm and the violence that we've been talking about, there is this sort of profound love of nature that is experienced and continues to be experienced and continues to inform educational initiatives and community engagement. I really loved Ari's paper for that point, too. And then kind of building on another question, what are the spaces, what are the geographies, the temporalities in which natural history is incentivized? We've had a lot of papers on 18th century natural history. We're at the APS, sorry guys. But there are certainly other temporalities, and we did begin to think about the future as a space for natural history collecting as well. We've talked a lot about American natural history because of the exhibition that we're going to go see in a minute, but we've talked about natural history in all parts of the world. So we've had Australia, we've had China, we've had Europe more broadly, we've had South America. So what are the spaces where natural history has happened and continues to happen? What are the spaces that maybe hasn't had as much of a focus from a natural historical perspective? And then I guess the final question before I get to my last point is, what are the costs and responsibilities of natural history? And I think we've started to touch on that in this wrap-up. Who does natural history and for whom? That's always the question that motivates a lot of the work that I do beyond the APS. What are the ethical considerations, the civic considerations, the educational considerations, the ecological and the historical considerations that all of us as an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary community can think about together to begin to address. And then finally, it's going back to this question of labor and whose labor both makes this possible. And to that end, I would like to thank a few folks for their labor throughout today. Specifically, Todd and Jeremy Schoenrock, who have done a brilliant job of managing the AV. So if you'll join me in just thanking them for their continued work. Want to thank Brenna Holland, Jessica Frankenfield, Kathy Person, and Gina Sarita for providing support both throughout the year, really, and throughout the day. Gina helped me on mics. Kathy was helping Thomas with the front registration. Jessica was milling about. Brenna just makes my life easier in so many ways. And then also thank Michelle McDonald and Bob Hauser for their support in making this event possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, my colleagues at the Academy me, Bob Peck and Marina McDougall, who were on the committee who put this fine program together, and of course Pedro Raposo, who again has been my co-conspirator in all of this. And finally, I can never say enough thanks to Thomas Johns, who quite literally is my other brain at this point. So just join me in thanking Thomas for... And then finally, a thank you to all of you, to the panelists, to the moderators, to everybody who showed up today, who stuck around today. Let's go have a drink and toast all of our achievements, shall we? Cheers to that. All right. Thank you all.